So, okay, today what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how you can enforce accessibility of when you use MUI components. And to do that, what we've done is we've created a MUI version of our recipe dashboard. So for those of you who are familiar with Deque demos, we have this recipe dashboard that we use for our demos. And we've created a MUI version of that so we can show you the power of the linter for linting MUI components. And that's what you're looking at now. So the source code for that is implemented all in React. And you can see here I've got VS Code. And I've got the VS Code Axe linter plugin installed. So Liz could probably put a link into the chat here for those of you who aren't familiar with this. If you miss the link and you want to find it, it's pretty easy to find. You can just search for Axe linter VS Code and it'll, or even Axe VS Code, and it'll be the first result that'll pop up in your search result. And I'm going to use that to demo the power of the features that I'm going to be talking about today. And I'm also going to be talking about how then you can, there's a companion to that you can use on the back end in your CI/CD process to enforce that accessibility, even if the developer doesn't have VS Code or ignores the VS Code input. So what's so special about custom components, MUI components from a linting perspective? Well, unlike with just standard HTML, if I go here and I type in some standard HTML, and I'm just going to accept what Copilot suggests to me. When I've got the linter installed and I create something that requires an accessible name, like a button, for example, and I leave that accessible name out, then the linter knows that there's no accessible name, and it can give me a violation for that element, and it tells me how to fix that. So that's this kind of standard functionality that the linter provides. It also provides, like most of Deque's, in fact, all of Deque's products that provide accessibility analysis results. There's a link that I can click here to open up the Deque University rules page for this. That'll tell me how to the various different ways that I can fix this issue as well. So from within, the power of that is that from within my source code, as I'm typing as a developer, I'm instantaneously getting feedback on whether or not the certain accessibility issues are being made, and I can immediately take action and fix those. The difference when I, instead of using a standard HTML button component, if I use a button component instead of a button element, now what the linter is saying is, oh, I don't really know what that button component is. It might have an accessible name baked into it. So because our approach with linting and with all of our products at Deque, in fact, is to have zero false positives, we don't want to raise an issue where there might not be an issue. So we rather say nothing. And so that's the approach that we take in the product. If we didn't do that, then every time you used any of your own custom components like this, it would immediately complain to say, I don't know what this component is. Now, we have talked about an option for the linter where you could turn that on, and it would be strict, and it would complain about any component it doesn't know anything about. In fact, if you think that's a good idea, we'd really like to get your feedback on that. Just let us know if you think that that's a feature that you would find useful. But the default that we currently have implemented today is we're going to stay silent on things we don't understand. So the good news is that there are some built-in component libraries that we understand and have built the mappings for into Axe linter. And I'm just going to go and fetch the configuration that I need. The two that we currently have configurations for that you can just sort of import by saying global libraries, and then import whichever of those that you're using. In this case, I'm importing the MUI material component mapping. And we also have one for our open source component library called Cauldron. It's the Cauldron React implementation. And so those are the two that are built into Linter. So by pulling these in to my configuration file here, now you'll notice that it all of a sudden understands what that button component is, and it now knows that there's no accessible name being provided. So that's the difference between having support for a custom component in your linter and not having support for a custom component in your linter, is now that when I have that, if I use a component in an incorrect fashion, the linter will be able to complain about that and tell me how to fix it. Now you'll notice that because this button component actually maps to a button element, you can see that here, it's telling me the exact same thing it told me when I used just the button HTML element itself, and it's giving me that same a link that I can go to for the remediation guidance on how to fix that. So that's sort of the power that you get from this capability. So let's go ahead and show you what happens if I then actually try to ignore this and commit this code to the repo. So if I go, so let's do git commit -am feature. Let's say I'm going to add a button. I wish I could type. And I'm going to do no verify, because if I let it verify, it's going to find that same lint issue and stop me from committing my code. So I've verified, I've committed that, and I'm going to push that up to GitHub so we can see the power of that same functionality in the CI/CD pipeline. So if I go over to Git, you can see I've pushed the workshop branch up to Git, and I can create a pull request. I'm just going to leave the defaults here because we don't need much more than that right now. And what it's going to do now is it's going to start the linter. The power of the linting that is occurring when you do it inside the pull request like this is unlike with the VS Code, when you open it up, it's going to lint any file that you open up, right? Whether you've changed that file or not. And it's going to complain about any change or any issue in any of those files, regardless of whether that's something that you as a developer have created. But the good thing about the linter server is it actually looks at the changes and only provides linting feedback on the actual changes that are in that pull request. So here you can see once again the exact same feedback within my pull request, so that as a pull request reviewer, I can see what's going on, and between the reviewer and the developer, they can make the right decision on what to do with that. Hopefully that decision is to fix that. So that's the basics for what this built-in capability allows you to do. It allows you to for any built-in MUI component to pick up all the mappings that are necessary for you to know whether you're using that component in a way that will leverage the built-in accessibility that it has available to it. So let's take another example that goes a little bit further. So say I wanted to, in fact, create an icon button because I want to, say, for example, be able to delete. It's going to get me to try to do an ARIA label. I don't want to do that right now. So I'm going to say, okay, let's pull in that icon button. That button isn't very useful. So what I'm going to also do is add material UI icons to my project. So I'm going to say you want to add material UI icons. And then I'm going to put a delete icon inside of this. All right. I think it's just like that. Come on, you can import that. You're not going to import that yourself? All right, very good. I'll import it for you then. Sometimes Copilot works just perfectly, and sometimes Copilot is a pain in the ass. There you go. Now all of a sudden it decides to work properly. All right, so I've added the delete icon onto that, and in fact I can just save this and go and look at it. The rendering inside. Whoop, we have. No, not added. Anybody know what might be going on with my? Maybe I need to add it in the down below. Might be the thing that I need. Typical developer demo problem. So, okay, that's not there. Oh,
the application, or maybe reload the page, or try to install MUI again.
yeah.
Demo gods are always not kind, so somebody's feeling you there.
I'm wondering why I'm in this. Why I'm in this directory. And
maybe check the import path.
Let's just do this. Don't know what it was, something weird. Anyway, here we have a nice delete button now. We're working just dandily after all that sweating that I had to do to get it to work. Okay, so the problem though in this particular instance is that delete icon is not part of the things that we support in our standard mappings, because I think there are over 10,000 of these icons, so we didn't want to bloat our linter package by including definitions for all of those. So once again, we're in the same situation that we were before, that even though it understands what the icon button is and had found an issue, as soon as I inserted inside of that an element that it doesn't understand, it now the linter is saying to itself, "Ooh, that delete icon might actually contain some content, which might be able to provide the accessible name for this icon button. Therefore, I'm just gonna remain silent on that." So there's a way that you can get around that. I went through all of that pain because I wanted to be able to show you that there's a way that you can then define for yourself some of these unknown components, whether they're your own global components or whether they're components that are from a third party. You can go in and define that component and how it maps to the underlying HTML, so that the linter knows what to do with that. So for this particular one, I'm saying a delete icon maps to an SVG element. The attributes that we wanted to take over are, it has the attribute RA hidden, and it has a default value of true. so that we know that this delete icon is going to basically be hidden from the screen reader. So once we save that, we should, if it's getting interpreted correctly. Oh no, I've got a syntax error here. Where's my syntax error? Come on. You should aria hidden. Why is that not working? So this works. That doesn't work. No. Attributes. I should be able to just define attributes. And then the default value. That should work. Oh, voila, it was my indenting like an idiot. Okay, so now that I've defined that custom component mapping correctly myself, it now understands that this delete icon isn't actually providing any content to this element. And so now, once again, it's able to tell me what I need to do in order to be able to fix that. So this combination of having these sort of pre-built components, MUI components for you that you can use, and the ability to easily add either your own component mappings for your own components, or mappings for some of the things like this support elements that are defined that we don't provide mappings for just because of the volume of the number of things that we'd have to define. Allows you to really ensure that you can get the maximum coverage and the maximum value out of what the linter can do with sort of minimal impact. The great thing about this feature is that you can also use this for your own custom component libraries. So when you actually develop and deploy and distribute your own custom libraries, you could provide these mappings along with them, so that the developers of those using those component libraries can can have the correct configuration to be able to ensure that they use those component libraries correctly. The great thing about this too is now if I, with all those changes that I've made, where I've added a bunch of stuff to the linter, the YAML package, and all that sort of stuff that is necessary to make this happen. If I push this all to the server, and I got to do, sorry, another verify. Then that configuration can then be used once again by the server to validate that code as well. So I'm not going to wait for the results of this to pop up, but the exact same thing will occur inside the backend linter server as well. So that's the power and the basic functionality that I wanted to show you. I'm going to give you a short overview of all the various features that you have as available to you when you want to do this custom component configuration. So let me start my presentation. So the first thing you can do is map your component name to the underlying HTML element. So for example, if I'm creating an image component, maybe there's a particular styling, maybe it's got a lightbox treatment or whatever I want to have within my application. Just by putting the element colon and the element name, I can map that custom component to that HTML element, and that already picks up quite a lot of default linting functionality just with that simple mapping. Then I have the ability to map custom attributes to known HTML attributes. So for example, if I've got in my custom image component the attribute alternative dash text, and that maps to the alt attribute underlying. I don't know why I would do that, because that's taking something very short and sweet and turning it into something very long and tedious, but at least you can do this. What it'll do is anytime the user uses the alternative dash text attribute, it'll assume that that's mapping to the alt attribute underlying it, and it'll interpret that in the appropriate way. So for example, if I have this button component that I want to create, so here we have a button component. In this case, I've got a message attribute, which is providing the alternative text or the name for that element, and I'm using some other ARIA attributes on that: ARIA controls, ARIA expanded, ARIA col index. Then the way that I would map that is, first I would map obviously to the element button, which is underlying that, and then the second thing I can do is I can map that message attribute to a special value called text, and what that tells the linter is that attribute is going to end up being the text content for that element, and then the linter can use all of its normal rules to interpret that in the appropriate ways. So that's a very valuable way of being able to map things that are in an attribute value that end up in the text content. The second thing that you can do is map all ARIA attributes very easily with a single entry to their equivalents by using ARIA-star. That's a very valuable way of saying that this element accepts all of the standard ARIA attributes that the user passes in should be passed through. If you don't support all of the ARIA attributes, then of course you could specify just the list of things that you do allow to be passed through to your custom component. So for example, you might, if you were implementing, well, we can talk about this when I show you the next example, where there's actually a good reason for doing this. So the other way you could do a custom button is to actually allow the button name to come from the content itself. And in that case, you can really do a shortcut, which is you can just do my button component : button. And then what that says to the linter is every attribute that the user uses on this element, I want you to pass all those attributes through. So we don't have to specify that the ARIA attributes can be passed through. We don't have to specify which other attributes might map or pass through. Any attribute that the user uses, we are telling the linter that any of those attributes will be mapped directly to the equivalent attribute in the same named attribute in HTML. So let's look at the slider example. So here we have my slider component, and when we create that, we can provide 4 different values: the ARIA value min, which is the minimum value of the slider, the value max, and the current value, ARIA value now. And then we're also providing an accessible name using ARIA label equals volume. So this is a good example where you might not support all of the ARIA attributes. You might just support the ones that really make sense. And in fact, I'm also going to use this to show you how you can deal with default role values as well. Because one of the things you can see here is how does the linter know that a slider component is the ARIA slider role, because it doesn't map to a standard HTML semantic HTML element. It's going to map to a non-semantic HTML element, but then it needs to pick up a role value in order to be accessible. But the user doesn't have to provide that role value. It's implicit. It's implemented in the component itself. So you'll do that in the following way by saying, okay, my element here is a div, and I want to map all the ARIA attributes through. I could have restricted this once again to just the ones that we pass through. I'm using ARIA-star right now just for brevity, but this is how you would then specify that there is a default role. So I've specified role : and then 2 additional specifications. The one where the default slider is telling it that the default role is slider. Now, if I just had default slider there, that would mean that the component also allows the role to be provided by the user, overriding the default slider role. That's not the case in my implementation of my slider component. I don't want anybody, the user of this component, to change it from a slider component to something else, because then the semantics are not going to match all of the implementation, and it's going to be a mess. So by in my implementation, I can stop that by just ignoring any role passed in, and I can tell the linter that that is the case by saying, sorry, name equals null. And that tells the linter that the user cannot override this default value. And that can be done for any of the attributes or any mappings that you have where you've got a default value that can or cannot be overwritten. You can do this, use the same approach to have a value and then specify whether or not that value can be overridden. So yeah, that brings me to the end of the demonstration. All of this is documented. For those of you who are just using VS Code, you can go to docs.deque.com/linter 4.0.0/en/VS Code-custom-components, and all of this is documented with examples. And the same configuration works if you're using the Axe linter server. And for those of you who are interested in playing around with that, you can get a free trial, I think it's a 2-week trial of that by signing up at the link that Liz is going to share with you all in the chat and in the follow-up email. And you can actually play around with both the integration into GitHub. The one that I just showed you is available as part of that trial. There's also a connector which can be used as part of a pre-commit hook. That same connector can be used inside any other CI/CD process to lint the code and provide the feedback to that process in a similar way to the way that we provide that inside the GitHub action that we provide. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Liz and open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dylan, for sharing all of that great information on the linter. We do have quite a few questions. So I will dive right in. Here's a few. I'll go with some of the VS Code ones first. Someone said that they're assuming that Axe linter for VS Code is free, or is that a paid service? Can you provide some clarification there?
Yeah, Axe linter for VS Code is free. You can download it from the Microsoft Store. You know, and so yeah, it's freely usable. We do have an enterprise version of that for organizations that are concerned about security, because when you install from the store, it is going to download some components dynamically, and if that's not acceptable from a security perspective, then we do have a paid version as part of the Axe DevTools linter server package. You get a secure version of the VS Code bundle that doesn't need to download any additional components. But for anyone who doesn't have those restrictions, it's available for free.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then a couple questions about some other options. So is the linter available in PHP Storm?
No, not yet. We are working on, currently working on an IntelliJ linter integration, and I'm not sure whether that's going to support WebStorm. So we may have to get back to you on that. I don't know whether that one will support that or whether it's just IntelliJ.
Got it. All right, switching gears here. So someone said, since it provides that custom configuration, this would work with entirely non-MUI components, wouldn't it?
Yes, the custom component mapping thing will work with any custom components, and all of this functionality that I've shown you works with not only with React but also with Vue and Angular and with straight up HTML components. So yeah, the capability that I showed you is more than just MUI. What I really wanted to underline in the beginning was that we have built-in support for the MUI components, right? You don't have to define any of those mappings yourself, except for when you pull in things like the icons that I struggled to get to work. but yeah, so no, the capability is there for your own custom components, regardless of what those are written in. You know, those can be, you know, movie based or non-movie based. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And just for clarification there, someone also asked if Axe DevTools linter supports custom grommet, or is that how you say it? Components?
How's that spelled?
GROMMET. Sorry if I.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with grommet, but if grommet is, you know, either React, Angular, Vue, or just straight up HTML, then we can support it. You can create your own mappings, and we should be able to support it. But I'm not really familiar with grommet.
Okay, no worries. Okay, someone says, this linter seems very beneficial for code bases with components that are reused across the app or for custom component libraries. That said, it seems like it might be overkill for code bases that mostly contain specialized single-use components. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that is exactly the case, but the custom component functionality is not going to be of any benefit if you don't have any custom components. But the linter itself provides a lot of value if you're writing straight up HTML yourself. So if you're using React and you're writing React code that essentially has all of the HTML elements being rendered directly inside that React code, then the linter will lint that because it knows what those HTML elements are. It doesn't need a mapping to work well with those. So that's one of the reasons why the linter is also great for the teams writing the components. They don't need any mappings while they're writing the components because they're telling essentially telling React or whatever how to generate HTML for the components themselves, right? So the linter is able to understand that code and is able to provide accessibility feedback on that code without any mappings.
Great, thank you, Dylan. Okay, someone asked, can it deal with more complicated components? For example, a component that is an input with a label where the label is set as a property of the component.
Yes, it can.
Okay.
I will say one caveat though. The linter, because of our approach of zero false positives, and because of the context of the linting that we're doing, wow, that's actually a good question. If it's a single, so if it's a single component that maps into multiple elements like that, we might not be able to deal. I'll have to go back and see if we can deal with that. We might not be able to do that directly. But just when it comes to form field labels in general, the linter is somewhat restricted in the sort of analysis that it can do because of the zero false positive approach. So we only can report on missing labels on inputs when we know for a fact that we're in the context of the entire page. So if your component is being used inside page snippets, then we are going to remain silent if there's a missing label. So until we can see the whole page, we don't complain about that. Hope
Got
that
it.
makes sense. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you, Dylan. Okay. Does the linter understand SCSS and SLIM template markup?
So SCCS, no, we don't. We do not do anything with CSS or anything like that. What was the second one?
SLIM or SLIM. I don't know if.
No, we don't do anything with that either.
Got it. All right. So is pattern matching supported? The example given for mapping to a specific MUI icon is why they ask. Their team has standardized around aliasing named imports for icons. For example, import delete as delete icon. So matching by pattern would allow rules to apply to any icon.
That's something that's not currently supported, but is a great feature request.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we have thought of that, and so if you think that's an important feature, come to the Axe community and talk to the product managers about that, and we can bump up the priority on that.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so I think this was when you were demoing, I think the linter server maybe. What if the accessible label depends on some component logic?
Yeah, we don't, very similar to the previous question about a single component that actually maps to two HTML components that are peers of each other rather than embedded in each other. The mappings right now are not as complex as they could possibly be. I think what we'd like to do is understand those use cases a bit better. So if you wanted to come to the Axe community Slack and talk to us about what your use cases are, we can see what enhancements we could make to better support some of the common use cases that we can't currently support. The approach that we've taken is that most component libraries like that they have pretty granular components, and they map more or less one-to-one to HTML elements. And we've initially, at least, created this component mapping functionality to support that. And so we're trying to understand the use cases that we still don't support that are important enough to support in the future.
Awesome. Thank you, Dylan. Okay, so this person says, so if they have a custom component library that they use in their code base, then this linter would be beneficial. Would there be any case of complications caused by the linter? And do you have any suggestions on how to not misuse it?
What are the complications? The VS Code linter, not very many. I can't think of any complications really. If you're using the backend linting, then that's going to introduce a little bit of build time to your CI/CD process, your pull request, actions, whatever needs to happen before the pull request can be approved. But generally, that is, we're talking about seconds of delay here. As long as you use the appropriate integration. So the integration that I showed you is one which looks at the files that have changed and only lints the files that have changed, right? So one way that you can misuse that is to, instead of linting just the changed files in a pull request, is you lint the entire source code base. Right, and that's a mistake that some people do make, and you can avoid that just simply by using the code snippet example that we give you, that first asks Git for the files that have changed, and then lints only those changed files. So it's pretty easy to get around.
Great, thanks, Dylan. Would you consider providing a default mapping for MUI or other libraries? For example, MUI's list component defaults to a UL. A default config available for usage would provide a nice baseline and provide good examples that they can use to start customizations.
So we do provide the default mapping. In fact, just by simply, let me stop sharing, let me stop presenting here. Simply by putting this at the top of your linter YAML file, you're automatically pulling in those mappings, and you can use those mappings as they are. What that doesn't do is it doesn't show you what the mappings are. So if people are interested in those mappings or want access to those, that's something we could consider. Once again, please come to the community Slack and talk to us about that. But this should provide you straight out of the box all mappings for all the material UI components. We've done everything in the sort of the core package.
Great, thanks, Dylan. Can you please explain again why you need to add a global library to the Axe linter config file if it's one that has built-in support? For example, I saw you added @MUI /material, but I thought it has built-in support like React, Angular, HTML, etc.
The reason that we get you to import it yourself is because if we automatically use these definitions here, so for example, there's actually a conflicting definition between the Cauldron React and the Material UI libraries. They both have a definition for a button with an uppercase B. And you might have, if you're not using Material UI, then you might have your own button with an uppercase B that you've created that has a different implementation completely from the Material UI one. So if we automatically pulled in the Material UI things, even when the underlying project isn't using Material UI, then we would incorrectly and potentially conflictingly lint for the components in that are being used in that particular code base. So what we're essentially asking you to do is to say, hey, I'm using Material UI in this project by doing this definition over here. And then the rest of it is automatic. You don't have to do the definitions yourself. We've done that work for you.
Great. A couple questions here that are related to coverage, comparing the linters with Axe Core. And then someone asks, how much more will this back-end extension pick up versus running Axe DevTools in the web mode? Or will the errors it detects be similar? Can you speak a bit to the coverage between the two?
So the errors it detects will be a strict subset of what Axe DevTools otherwise picks up. Mm-hmm. So they're essentially the same rules, just slips essentially limited down to what we can with certainty determine in the context of the source code. So that's the first thing to say. In terms of coverage, it's very difficult for us to exactly tell the amount of coverage. Our estimate is it's about half as much as you get from Axe DevTools itself or Axe Core. And the reason for that is some of the things I talked about earlier. First of all, we don't have the context of the entire application during runtime, so we don't, for example, know what the full page looks like often, and that means we have to make assumptions, and sometimes we make assumptions where we then have to ignore something that we would otherwise flag as an issue. The example of the missing label is a good example. If we don't know that we're in the context of the page itself, we don't know for a fact that there's not going to be a label added at some point when the entire application gets assembled. So that's the one reason. The other reason is because we're not running the entire assembled application, we're also not applying styles to the page. So therefore, we cannot we cannot do assessment of anything that might be dependent on or influenced by a style. So those are the reasons why the coverage is lower, but it's a strict subset.
Got it.
The other thing to say though is that the instantaneous feedback that it provides to the developer is worth a huge amount, and the fact that you can get that same feedback in your CI/CD process with zero effort. You just have to set it up once in your CI/CD, and then every single pull request will automatically get linted. So there's even less effort than there is with Axe DevTools, and you get very valuable feedback that can help you to instantaneously fix what would otherwise be accessibility issues.
Great, thanks, Dylan. I think we got time for just a couple more questions here. How would you implement it in GitLab instead of GitHub? Is that possible?
It is possible. So we have the connector that I talked about, and that can be installed and run inside the context of a GitLab action, and you can get the feedback in that way. What we are still trying to figure out, and we haven't quite figured out how to do in a lightweight way, is how to annotate the code in the same way that we can annotate the code inside GitHub. GitHub gives us a very easy to implement interface to where we can just sort of in the output tell it the line numbers, and it does the annotation for us automatically. And that sort of capability, we haven't found out how to do that ourselves in GitLab. Otherwise, we would have already done that. So if anybody knows of an easy way to do that, we would definitely like to work with you on making a better GitLab integration. But we have the command line connector as the sort of default way that you can do that.
Awesome. And let's go with one more question here. Any plans on making this use language server protocol, or is this already using one?
So the VS Code extension uses language server protocol.
Got it. Great. Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Dylan, for a great demo and presentation on all of these awesome MUI and linter capabilities. Thank you, everyone, for attending today and for this great engagement and all of these wonderful questions. We appreciate your time and hope you have a great day.
Yeah, thank you very much. Lovely
Thanks.
engagement. Thank you.